process for introductions now. Welcome to this morning's event, the Institute for Integrative Health monthly seminar series. Great to have you here. I am Rahel Khan. I'm one of the faculty in the Department of Psychiatry and joined the steering committee of the Institute for Integrative Health this past year. Today, I'm happy to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Joseph Tafur. Joe and I went to medical school together at UC San Diego, starting in '99. So we've known each other for some years now. Joe's background, he'll speak a little bit about in his talk, a little bit of autobiographical kind of storytelling. But just to give kind of the overview, he's from Phoenix, Arizona, went to undergrad at UCLA, and then medical school at UC San Diego, did his residency training here at UCLA in family medicine. And after he finished residency, we kind of came closer again together in physical space because he came to UCSD where I was finishing up my medical training at the time. I had gone with my PhD, and he joined the Department of Psychiatry as a research fellow looking at psychoneuroimmunology, working with a professor there, Dr. Paul Mills. And it was during that time as he was trying to chart a path into an integrative medical career for himself and also building his interest in exploring the research around integrative approaches that he deepened his own exploration with this Ayahuasca shamanism that I'm speaking about with us today. And it's been a great pleasure to share the journey of Joe's career, exploring the ways he can help people best and exploring ways that are not currently used by many folks in the West. Just so you know, he does have some books today. He's recently written a book called Fellowship of the River, where he speaks about a lot of the things he'll be covering in the talk today in more depth, including a series of case studies of people who come to the healing center that he helped start down in Peru and were struggling with medical and psychosomatic conditions for many years, not thoroughly addressed through mainstream approaches, people who had really breakthroughs with this approach. So without further ado, thank you very much for being with us today.
Not yet. I'm not supposed to be on the mic. Oh, I can turn it up.
Yes.
But it is up.
It's up.
Hello.
Okay.
Is it? Yeah.
Look on the board on the top of there.
It's off.
It's on.
It's on.
It's on.
Is it on in the back? You hear it? They say yes. Nice.
Oh, okay. No, I was not going to.
Okay, very good. No problem. Yeah, so it is my pleasure to be here at USC, thanks to my old friend Rahel, who's on faculty here in the psychiatry department, and giving me the opportunity to bring my experience to the university. You know, I do have a research, I'm a medical doctor, and I did spend some time in research at UCSD, and I'm very interested in academics. But I decided to go this other route, you know, which is a very clinical route, so to speak, and then also this kind of spiritual path route into Ayahuasca shamanism. And then my hope is trying to share some of what I learned from my experience. You know, there's a lot of people are going down to Peru right now to drink ayahuasca with the shamans and seek healing. Some people are just fooling around. A lot of people are going to seek healing, and a lot of people are getting very impressive healing. And so, as a doctor, watching that whole process, I want to share some of my thoughts, you know, and somebody with a research background, what I think is going on, and what maybe it can teach us about healthcare in general, about spiritual healing in general, about emotional healing in general, and possibly about the role of psychedelic medicines. So the title of my talk is Epigenetics and Ayahuasca Shamanism, illuminating the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality, which is the big topic of the book, which I have plenty of copies here if you're interested, The Fellowship of the River. So, I don't know if the clicker, do I have to turn it on? It is on. I'm just going to play it right here for now. kind of locked up here. Locked up. It says continue. Get out of here.
Sync.
Okay, well, not that. Get rid of that. So anyway, as Rael said, I went to UCSD and UCLA and all that stuff. UCSD, spent some time doing research, and then eventually, I ended up in Peru. So like I said, I wasn't academic culture per se, but I ended up went down 2007, got more involved, and started the Healing Center in 2011, where we started working with traditional healers and bringing down people from all over the world. Probably 1,000 people have been through that place now. And this is a group of naturopathic students there to the right, where we're bringing students, and we've had medical students come down and residents come down and kind of shadow under me and their experience. And that center is called Nihuerao Centro Espiritual. That's the website. It's the main shaman is there. Ricardo Maringo is a Shipibo shaman, a native of the region and a traditional healer from a deep shamanic tradition, who has decided to partner with Westerners and with us, and this is some of the team, to create this kind of integrative approach to treat Western people with very traditional healing. And so the book is about my experience and my journey going from medical school and all the way to not only going to start the Healing Center and work with Ricardo, but eventually to train in Ayahuasca shamanism, and to become an Ayahuasca shaman in a traditional way, and to work in ceremony that way, along with my traditional Western training. So it's a book about, as I mentioned, the integration, the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality. So those are the larger topics, and then of course we get into the specific discussion of this ayahuasca as the focus of a way to look at the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality. So when I was in medical school with Rael at UCSD in 1999, I became depressed. There's a large rate of depression among medical students. Not that highly discussed topic, but the study I cite in the book is like 30%. 1/3 is reported depression. I was one of those people. All the factors. Why me? Why not the other guy? But I hadn't really been depressed before that, and somehow the process to me was very depressing. It was very hard on my kind of sensibility. And I tried antidepressants for a little while. My dad is a psychiatrist. Tried antidepressants. A lot of the medical students were put on antidepressants, just like the soldiers. I don't know how many here are currently on antidepressants in the medical school. I'm not sure. I did find some benefit from that. Was able to continue forward, but I also was exposed around that time to kind of this renaissance of psychedelic research, clinical research, and started learning about the crossover between the SSRIs and the psychedelic medicines, the biochemical relationship between those two things, and how that affected my experience. And it kind of helped me to overcome my stigma about psychedelic medicine and healing, getting exposed to that kind of research. And so I came off antidepressants, which I only took briefly, and I went to do peyote in Arizona, where I'm from. And peyote is a hallucinogenic cactus, like a spiritual plant medicine. It is used in a ceremonial context. So I went to go seek healing and help from these people at the Peyote Way Church of God in Arizona, and I had a complete turnaround. I was like, oh my God, this is so helpful. Why isn't this more available? Why isn't anyone talking about this? And one night I had a massive turnaround in my mental health that really helped me keep going. So I got involved with that. I became very curious about that kind of thing while I was going through my training, and then eventually I got interested in ayahuasca. My family's from Colombia, and I knew that a lot of people were going down to South America, to the Amazon, to experience ayahuasca healing. So things I did not learn in medical school. Number one, there's just 2 points I make, I think, at the top. That's Ricardo Maringo, the shaman that I work with and train with, and now he's taking over the center in Peru. And Sweet the Mamich, our business partner, that helped us build the center, and is a healer in her own right, an artist. And so, first things I didn't learn in medical school, but I did learn on the side, meeting people like Rael, who are interested in neuroscience and altered states of consciousness, I got exposed to this resurgence of psychedelic clinical research. So it turns out psychedelic medicines are in fact clinically significant. They weren't teaching that in medicine, so I don't think they are still yet, working at the levels of mind, body, emotion, and spirit. So just to kind of touch, maybe a lot of people are already aware of this, but we'll just review, and some people have already heard, I think, the same talk, Ronan and a couple people, but thank you for coming. So first, the psychedelic renaissance. So, we had this big interest, psychiatrists were very interested in psychedelics in the early years from their first kind of discovery with LSD and the entrance of psilocybin from Mexico into the research world. And so that went on, for like 3 decades, 40s, 50s, 60s. People were like, wow, extremely interesting, extremely relevant to psychiatry and to mental health and to healing and then, maybe addiction and maybe deep emotional healing and getting over like deep emotional trauma. And then, things kind of went awry, and for a lot of different reasons, that's not the topic of this discussion. It became illegal, They made psychedelics illegal, and the war on drugs and all the issues surrounding some of the reckless use and then some of the subversion of the cultural paradigm, etc. And so by the late 60s and early 70s, no more psychedelic research, no more clinical research. It's over. Then in the 90s, in the early 90s, Rick Strassman from University of New Mexico, psychiatrist, got a DA exemption to look at DMT. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is a powerful psychedelic compound that is, the most, visionary component of the ayahuasca tea is the DMT, and people do use it independently as well. And so he got a chance to start researching this again. That became the subject of his book, DMT Spirit Molecule, in which he started to explore the idea that perhaps there is an endogenous, mystical system within the human body that is functioning during visionary states, whether it's through meditation or near-death experiences, etc., that then has a biochemistry that somehow is related to DMT, because when you give just a slightly increased dose, all of a sudden they're entering these visionary states. So it's as if the system is kind of waiting and ready to receive that. And then there was evidence and suggestion that DMT is being produced, that it is being produced within the human body, and perhaps, from the pineal gland, it's not verified, but what is its role? What is the role of endogenous DMT? And so he's exploring that in his research. And then that became a movie that I think is still on Netflix, DMT Spirit Molecule, fun movie to watch and a great overview if you get a chance. So then, from that point, now we see 2016, so now we've had this from the 90s, this is, 3 decades now that people have been re-looking at psychedelic medicines clinically, so we have time enough for even review articles. So this is actually coming out of Brazil, but antidepressive, anxiolytic, anti-addictive effects of ayahuasca, psilocybin, and LSD. This is a systematic review for the last 25 years, published recently. So now there's a lot of research that's kind of coming back on. One of the most significant studies that you may be aware of is the MAP study, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, has gotten behind and funded and gotten all the political support for this MDMA research. So MDMA, which I don't think I can even pronounce the real name, dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, also known, as ecstasy or Molly, has been part of this since 2011. Is when they started publishing this MDMA-assisted psychotherapy intervention for PTSD, for treatment-resistant PTSD. So these are people just like me in the Amazon. We're not anti-allopathic medicine. I'm not anti, what the Western paradigm has to offer. I'm simply saying there are many, many people, and everyone here is probably well aware of all the people who are not getting helped by the current situation. And the Vietnam vets is the most obvious example of PTSD. When you have a young Iraqi veteran showing up to a group therapy meeting with Vietnam vets, and he's thinking, oh my God, this is the rest of my life. That's the situation as it stands. And so then you see these guys are saying, we're only going to take the treatment-resistant people. If nothing's worked, that's the only way they get into the study. They get into the study where they only use the MDMA like maybe 1, 2, or 3 times. 1, 2, or 3 times. Versus the cavalier attitude to putting somebody on antidepressants or antipsychotics for decades. And yet this is like frowned upon 1, 2, or 3 times. And they're doing that within the context of a certain psychotherapeutic protocol that is designed to get the most out of those experiences and in fact makes the difference. So people just doing MDMA at a party or whatever, it's not quite what's happening with these guys. And you're seeing an 83% response rate in the initial group versus 25% in the placebo group. So this was pretty impactful, okay? This has gotten a lot of attention. And then they had follow-up studies, how durable is it, and they're finding durability improvement is there. They're testing these people at 17 to 74 months after the sessions. On average, subjects maintain statistically and clinically significant gains in symptom relief. Only 2 subjects relapsed with no interval treatment. Okay, just from the psychotherapeutic intervention with those few sessions of MDMA, and then they did so well. So the results persisted over time. No harm was reported. So because of this, the FDA has now agreed to kind of fast track to phase 3 trials. So now this is looking like a real possibility that MDMA will become a prescribable medicine within this context within the next few years. Okay, so that's the first psychedelic medicine. This is a reality. I was just presenting in Vancouver, they have MAPS Canada. They're opening the door for the same reason. They're saying, whoa, this is too incredible. The kind of, the little tiny improvements in PTSD treatment that we've achieved through other methods, and now this 83% long-lasting, safe, it's really a revolution, and it's going to bring the change in psychiatry and the attitude towards psychedelic medicine. Similarly, people are now looking at psilocybin. There's the Hefter Research Institute, kind of like MAPS, which is funding and getting behind some of this. So psilocybin came into the American world as these guys went down to get introduced to psilocybin mushroom ceremony with Maria Sabina and the Mazatec shamans in Mexico. And that just started this long line of events that ended up in psilocybin being this kind of a researchable molecule. And so one of the trials is coming out of UCLA here that's making an impact, pilot stage psilocybin treatment of anxiety in patients with advanced stage cancer, so end-of-life anxiety. What are they going to do? The last few weeks, months, years are miserable because they're so anxious about dying. And then they bring them through this protocol with psilocybin and therapy, and all of a sudden, they're able to die in peace. And so this is also making a big impact. No clinically adverse events, significant reduction in anxiety, 1 to 3 months after treatment, even 6 months later. And so this is opening up more research interest. So NYU is jumping on this research, and they're doing the same kind of thing, rapid and sustained symptom reduction following psilocybin treatment for anxiety and depression in patients with life-threatening cancer. Again, getting big results, longer-lasting results as they expand the number of people that are being treated and investigated. So this research is saying approximately 60 to 80% of participants continued with clinically significant reductions in depression and anxiety 6.5 months later. They're not on ongoing treatment. They're not getting pills and just going through the motions, for those 6 months. They were treated, now they're better, that is lasting 6 months later. So this is like a new kind of, this idea that some of this stuff can actually be healed. That's we kind of got off track there in mental health. My dad was a psychiatrist, I'm not against it. It's a very difficult issues to deal with, but perhaps our paradigm was a little too limited to really address this stuff. And it's not enough to tell somebody, hey, there's nothing that can be done. More appropriate would be, we don't know how to help you. Hopefully there's help out there for you. We all deep down believe that, in fact, yes, you can heal from a lot of things, and some people do. So how can we open that path, and how can we learn more about that possibility instead of just having a society with out-of-control epidemic of anxiety, depression, PTSD, addiction, despite all the funding and all the research. And it's going to drain, the healthcare resources. It is currently draining the healthcare resources, and it's not getting better. And it's looking like a cultural problem, and that cultural problem is reflected in the scientific approach to that problem. So it's about exploring. So part of the opening to expand the discussion is they're saying, as they at NYU, as they explore psilocybin with people, they say, wow, people are having mystical experiences with this psilocybin. Like a high percentage subjectively reported are saying they had a mystical experience according to a scale that they're using in their research to determine, how mystical of an experience it was. Did they lose sense of space and time? Did they feel like an oceanic boundlessness? And these things that are being drawn from mindfulness research. Did they enter a spiritual state, or what some people would call a spiritual state, or however they're describing as a mystical state? And they said, yeah, a lot of people when they go through this kind of treatment and they go through this kind of healing, and then another line of NYU research, when they're doing tobacco cessation, they're showing the ones that actually stopped smoking, they had a mystical experience. And the ones that didn't, well, they didn't. So it's just opening this door to the value of the mystical experience in healthcare, okay? Not just in whatever esoteric discussion. So that's happening, and so somehow this psychedelic experience and the associated mystical experience is somehow involved in a healing that is affecting anxiety and depression, that's affecting PTSD, and when we allow that kind of spiritual dimension into the discussion, we're seeing marked improvement in the patient. So when we're not so worried about the narrative of the, building the narrative of our scientific understanding, and we're more concerned about patient care, things open up a little bit. It's a more interesting thing. As Ralph Metzner, who's an old psychedelic researcher, says, science and medicine is not the same thing. Science and medicine is not the same thing. Scientific inquiry, a lot of us are very scientifically minded, we're very interested. And then there's the clinical side of medicine. There's your family, your child, your mother, they need help. You're not so worried like all the mechanisms are spelled out. You want to help them, they want to be healed, that's what you want for yourself. And so it's trying to remember that, and that's the focus of my experience down in the Amazon. So this is Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University. I was saying it was at NYU, but he's the one, and his group is the one at Johns Hopkins that's really focused on the role of the mystical experience in mental health outcomes in research. Which brings us finally to ayahuasca. So this is ayahuasca growing at the Medicine House at the center that I worked at for the last 6.5 years. And at Niue Rao as mentioned, and this is part of the tea, the brew. So the tea and the brew is made from the ayahuasca vine that you saw there, and then an additive that in most cases in Peru where we are is chacruna, which is a plant that contains DMT. And there's other plants that contain DMT that can be mixed with the ayahuasca vine to create the ayahuasca tea experience. So here's a study coming out of Brazil recently in the last year where they did a very clinical approach, just having somebody in a clinical setting and giving them ayahuasca, putting them in the SPECT. And they saw, really like single dose of ayahuasca in patients with recurrent depression, and they saw significant impact in a short-term follow-up with a small number of individuals, but these were all treatment-resistant people. And they had just one time ayahuasca, no ceremony, no shamans, nothing, and in the SPECT, and they had an improvement. So ayahuasca is an Amazonian botanical hallucinogenic brew which contains DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a 5-HT2A receptor agonist, and harmine from the vine, a monoamine oxidase A inhibitor. So we know that's some of the biochemistry of this ayahuasca, and that's significant, and there's a lot of research now in Brazil where it's legal to investigate these kind of things, and ayahuasca is readily accessible. Where they are very interested in the purely clinical, just ayahuasca as a tea, as a substance, and then they want to get into the molecules and the reduction view of ayahuasca, which again, we don't necessarily have a lot of experience around how beneficial that might be, but we are seeing a lot of anecdotal experience with the benefits of ayahuasca used within a traditional context. And so there are people who are trying to research that as well. One example, this was from their study, just showing increased blood perfusion in these left nucleus accumbens, right left subgenual area. So these are like limbic and paralimbic areas, and the emotional processing center of the brain seems to be a big target of the psychedelics. So implicated the regulation of mood and emotions were observed after ayahuasca intake. Adverse effect vomiting is part of the process. Traditionally it's not really seen as an adverse effect. But they saw that this was fast-acting and possibly sustained antidepressant properties from the ayahuasca. So now, here's the Shipibo shaman. So I work with Shipibo. Shipibo is one of the tribes in Peru that is still, their culture is still, relatively intact. They speak their language, a Native American language. They have the tradition with the plants in the forest that's still alive, and they're offering their medicine out to the world. And they're part of this new kind of, ayahuasca tourism. People would want to criticize for the money exchange, but it's a very interesting exchange between these traditional cultures and the West, and they're in fact helping many people. One example is this. So this is one of the shamans from Temple of the Way of Light, which is a center in Peru, where they're using ayahuasca in grief therapy. So people that have lost a loved one and what's the impact, and how do you get over the loss of a loved one, and within mental health, and they found that they're getting preliminary data showing very positive results with this approach, with ayahuasca, within the traditional context of people shamanism in Peru, in the rainforest. So there is more and more studies are being published, and more people want to investigate this kind of thing. They did a small study in Canada that is giving rise to a larger study about addiction with ayahuasca in a traditional setting. And I don't know if you guys know what Gabor Mate is, our doctor and an author and a speaker, and wrote the foreword to this book. And he was kind of helping to get this group together, and they did a work with Native Americans in Canada, and they found significant results in treating addiction with ayahuasca, publishable results. So that brings me to the story of the book, and what I'm getting at. So, the first thing I just want to review, kind of update, to let you guys know, hey, this is clinically significant. There is research about this stuff. It is getting published, and it's not just talk and, whatever hippie, new age stuff going on. And this is about real people getting help from real problems. And that's my interest as a doctor, and that's why I was down there. And it turns out the people shamans that I work with are also at that level of professional dedication. Although they may not have gone through the university, they have gone through their traditional training, which I have been through, which is very rigorous, very tough, and in fact, perhaps more illuminating, than some higher education opportunities that we have here. And so the book, once again, is about the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality, and it gets into my personal story, but then eventually gets into having the healing center and then the cases, starting to present cases and starting to look for a paradigm to try to understand how it is that we're helping these people, and I bring up the epigenetics, and so there's a book called Intelligence in Nature. Jeremy Narby had written another book that I began searching for common ground between indigenous knowledge and Western science, and ended up finding links between shamanism and molecular biology in the book The Cosmic Serpent. I presented the hypothesis that shamans take their consciousness down to the molecular level, gain access to information related to DNA, which they call animate essences or spirits. So it's like, how do we bridge this shamanic world when I'm working with Ricardo, who's saying, we're going to clean the spirits out of this person, and they have a significant healing, but that Western methods would agree, yes, the person is better. And how do we bridge that? How can we bridge this kind of magical approach, or what we would consider a magical approach? What are they talking about that's relevant to our world? And so that's what I became very curious about. And in the book, I explore this potential role of epigenetics as this place where perhaps some of this energy healing is going on. And so I mentioned a few cases in the book: migraine headache, PTSD, idiopathic chronic cough, Crohn's disease, which all responded to a very similar, although using slightly different plants, traditional Amazonian plant medicine treatment within a Shipibo-style ayahuasca shamanism kind of approach as well. What physiology leads these problems? So in other words, as a medical doctor, you see, the migraine's going to go to neurology, PTSD to the psychiatrist, idiopathic chronic cough to the pulmonologist, Crohn's disease to the GI. But none of these patients got better. And all of them had been going to the doctor for years and years and years, and in some cases, decades. So they'd all been shuffled along. I'm a family medicine doctor. I've been part of that. I've been part of shuffling them over here, and they're not getting any better, and we're not even hoping that they get better. It's just like, we don't know how to make them better, and so you tell them you're screwed, you're stuck with this. But yet, these people, in some cases, in a very short treatment approach, massive change in their health, in measurable health symptoms and even, physiologic issues improve. So what commonalities make such problems potential targets for this shamanic approach and this plant medicine approach? What's in common between these things? Well, what was linking all these cases was emotional trauma. Emotional trauma was the key. Healing their emotional trauma is what allowed their physical symptoms to improve and resolve. In each one of the cases I just talked about, this psychosomatic illness, or so-called psychosomatic illness, it was emotionally rooted. And the reason I say this is because once they went through a deep emotional healing, they got better. So the link is emotional trauma. In each case, their problem involves dysfunction in the emotional body. So then I'm starting to try to define the emotional body in Western terms. Ayurveda is talking about emotional body. Chinese medicine can talk about emotional body, but for us, we're not quite ready to talk about emotional body. We admit that we have emotions, but it's kind of unprofessional, to talk about your emotional life in a scientific academic setting, beyond like filling out surveys about your mood. Where is emotional trauma stored in the body, and how does it contribute to the symptoms that we just described in these people? How does emotional healing, inspired by spiritually oriented techniques like shamanism, help to alleviate such problems and simultaneously generate physical change? So PTSD is a big focus, as I mentioned, in the MDMA trial, and a lot of people are going down to ayahuasca. From, veterans are starting to head down there, and there's a lot of interest about ayahuasca shamanism and its ability to heal PTSD, not just from war trauma, but from rape and sexual abuse and other things that people have been through. So I present a case in the book. This friend of mine, Russ, who's a Vietnam vet. So he had a profound emotional healing experience that led to an increased capacity to cope with stress, both psychologically and physically. He had cardiovascular improvements, blood pressure, heart rate improvements. He lost a lot of weight. His diabetes improved. His lifestyle improved. He was able to kind of control himself a little more. So this healing occurred in his emotional body. So what is the emotional body? Well, first is the medium through which we experience emotion and feeling. Okay, so I would say that's just a real thing. If we're going to be honest, somewhere we experience emotional and feeling, and a lot of people talk about it as the emotional body. Physically, it's the apparatus connected to our experience of emotion and the feeling in our bodies. Namely, I'm saying it's the psychoneuroendocrine immunologic network. So I spent this time in mind-body medicine, psychoneuroimmunology, the study of mind-body medicine, psychoneuroimmunology, or psychoneuroendocrine immunology, the expanded kind of study. The psychoneuroendocrine immunologic network as described in mind-body medical research. So this is like, what was psychosomatic research has become P&I research, and it's a huge opening right now in understanding how stress affects illness, et cetera, et cetera. So point number 2, things that I learned, psychoneuroendocrine immunology is clinically significant, describing phenomena affected by the mind, body, emotion, and potentially spirit. And I say that because when you have some of these people go through spiritual healing and you see improvement in their physical, emotional body, their P&I network functioning improves. So emotional body, just to kind of get into, what do I say is this P&I network? What is the emotional body? It includes the limbic brain, paralimbic structures in the brain, the autonomic nervous system, elements of the immune and endocrine systems. One perfect example is the HPA axis. The stress response system in the body is a core element of the emotional body. And we can see how emotional trauma disrupts HPA axis function, and emotional healing restores HPA axis function, PTSD being a prime example. So pretty much got all that. So PTSD in the emotional body. And PTSD, deep-seated emotional trauma, lurks within and disturbs multiple elements of the emotional body, the P&I network, causing overwhelming fear and anxiety psychologically, overactive fight or flight response in the nervous system, abnormal adrenaline and cortisol levels in the endocrine system, out of control inflammation of the immune system. So you see this network, this constellation is actually functioning like an organ system. It works together. The HPA axis crosses traditional kind of organ compartmentalization of our anatomical understanding of the body. This is functioning as a unit in stress research. And that's called the P&I network, and I'm saying this is the emotional body. Emotional healing through shamanic techniques and otherwise heals PTSD in part by improving the function of the HPA axis. We see this happen, and other elements within the emotional body. Just some research, just to show you, it's like, got a lot of studies cited in the book, I'm not just making this up. Migraine headaches, just to give you another example, and then we'll wrap it up here in a little while for questions. Here's somebody that came down in her 30s. She had really bad migraine headaches for years, worse with her menstrual cycle. She's taking triptans. Triptans are tryptamines, by the way, just like this dimethyltryptamine, this psychedelic compound. And so there's some kind of relevance there, some kind of crossover between the role of psychedelics and some of these headache treatments. And we are seeing they're using the cluster buster studies and using psilocybin for cluster headaches. There's some relationship there. Okay, between psychedelic medication and triptans being used regularly for migraine headaches. So she's been on medication for years, decades, or I don't know, years, I guess a decade, and really suffering. I can't work or anything with her menstrual cycle, it's so bad. And then she comes for 10 days. After 10 days of treatment with ayahuasca shamanism and plant medicine, she has nearly 1 year without a significant headache. During this year, she also received continued psychological support, And then, so she did have support. She had this idea of integration, that it's not just enough to go through it. You need support to kind of bring home the messages and what you learn and what you experience. And this is a good friend of mine, and she did her integration with my cousin, who's kind of coaching people from returning. So I've known her for years. You know, that's 2 years later, she came back for 2 weeks and had just a further improvement. Now with some ongoing menstrual pain, not so much migraines, and she's better from that too now. Okay, these are, not everyone is improving at this rate, but there are a lot of people that do improve in a similar fashion, so it's worth looking at. So what happened to her? You know, her ceremonial treatment in the ceremonies was all about dealing with this emotional trauma from her childhood with her father. Father was a raging, angry person and loving, so we had this push and pull of like, oh, I'm trying to please my dad, but I can't please my dad because he's a raging maniac. And he's very aggressive and very, you know, a lot of scathing comments back and forth. And you see that. And I saw living down there, like I said, living with the patients instead of just my usual 15-minute doctor visit as a family medicine doctor. But now I'm living with them for 10 days, you know, and we're eating and hanging out and we do ceremonial life. And I was starting to see that, hey, some of the migraine people, they were exposed to a lot of aggressive yelling and screaming when they were children. And this idea of the sensory integration problem and this crossover and sensory overload, where they have this vulnerability to certain smells or sounds or lights, all of a sudden they're pushed into this like overreactive stress response and this migraine headache. So, you know, she was one of those people. So she had to go through this huge like energetic purge, you know, with ayahuasca and all these crazy mystical experiences, but also she had to go through this forgiveness process with her father. And that is how she healed her migraines, you know. If you don't want to believe it or whatever, she doesn't care, okay? If you believe it or you don't believe it, that's what she went through, and that was the answer to her healing, and it really changed her life. So, you know, I had an experience because I was training in the shamanism. I'm just sharing this little fun tidbit. You know, training in the shamanism, ayahuasca shamanism, and so then we sing to people to help facilitate this process, to clear and clean these energies of the traumas with her father, etc. It's a form of energy healing like Reiki or something like that. And I had an experience where I was singing to her one night when she was having a tough time, and in my visions, I saw this like chromatin, like the DNA with the proteins, the chromatin, and I saw this dragon swimming through the nooks and crannies of it. And ayahuasca, you know, my visionary, crazy, mystical experience, probably just foolishness, told me, you know, Joe, her problem is not in her genes, it's on top of her genes. So it's not just like, yeah, maybe she has a hereditary, you know, story with all these migraines, but it's not in her genes, it's on her genes. This idea that it's epigenetic. And so we see this epigenetic story where we get this tagging of the DNA strand or the protein surrounding the DNA strand that influence the function of the cells at every single level. The difference between a muscle cell and a neuron, they have the same DNA. It's epigenetic programming that creates the differentiation of the expression. So it is a supremely important part of the biological story. And then to think that that epigenetic software, as I call it, can be influenced by so many different things as we're learning every day all the time: diet, nutrition, pharmaceuticals, in vitro exposure, not in vitro, but whatever you call it, in the womb. And remember how to talk it right now. In utero exposure, okay? And so then we also see that there's evidence that epigenetics are responding to emotional stress and strain. That there's clear evidence that this is true. So, and that the epigenetics would potentially improve in an emotional healing situation. So, in my visions, the energies that Ricardo's like, oh, we got to clean the energy of the father's trauma, and all that stuff. In the visions, clean out the dragon, as it were, in the visionary place. But how does that relate to what's going on inside her? In the physical dimension, these energies manifest as stress-related damage in the stress response system and the larger P9 network, the psychoneuroendocrine network, the emotional body. These disturbances in the emotional body can generate psychosomatic symptoms like through processes like neurogenic inflammation. So neurogenic inflammation is thought to be now, new research is indicating, maybe underlying things like psoriasis and migraine headache and Crohn's disease, where the nerves are generating inflammation in the absence of any irritant or insult, and it appears in some cases to be due to unresolved emotional processes. the body crying out, something is wrong in here. And so you see this neurogenic inflammation. So that's a very interesting area of research. Curiously enough, such inflammation can improve after significant emotional and spiritual healing. Yes, okay, they have neurogenic inflammation. They're trying to develop drugs to treat neurogenic inflammation, but it turns out if this person goes through this deep emotional healing process, that quiets down. And that was her experience. So idiopathic chronic cough also thought to be due to neurogenic inflammation. So all these cases that I'm presenting, it's like, hey, wow, they're emotionally rooted. They cause this problem in this emotional body as defined. And even there's this common processes like neurogenic inflammation. So that seemed to be related to unresolved emotional trauma. Current research supports the idea that the energies of childhood trauma live on within us in imprints in the epigenome. In monkey and human studies, the biological memory of childhood maltreatment has been linked to epigenetic imprints. In monkeys, these lasting epigenetic imprints can be detected later in cells and tissues of the body, the canine network. Immune cells, limbic brain cells, paralimbic brain cells. So migraine headache, I went back. There's just one of the examples of the studies talking about this. Differential rearing in monkeys leads to differential DNA methylation. That's an epigenetic process. Some of the other research about epigenetics and migraine, childhood maltreatment and migraine. Unresolved emotional issues hang on in the emotional body as what in Shipibo terms would be described as unhealthy energies. So shamanically, we needed to clean out the spirits or energies associated with Lisa's father's anger, her psychological trauma, her own anger. And so Ricardo was always teaching, we got to clean this stuff out with the songs. Clean out their ancestral stuff. Clean out their in utero stuff, their infancy and childhood, adolescence, adult life, things from where they live, things from their relationships. Where do these stories live on within us? Well, one of the places that it seems like we know they live on with us is in the epigenetics. And so we know that kind of very environmental nutritional toxicity is harming epigenetics, and we know that that's a big part of the cancer problem and the diabetes problem and neurodegeneration and even autism. But it turns out emotional toxicity also damages the epigenetics and seems to be very much at the root of problems like depression, addiction, anxiety, PTSD, and emotional body problems. So it's very relevant in modern healthcare. And then there's a Crohn's disease case I'm not going to get into. But
Can you go back to that list before?
Which one?
Family, the parents, the adolescent, that.
Yeah, okay. This talk basically was given at the MAPS conference earlier this year. There's a big YouTube, and it's all there. Okay, so you can pause it on YouTube and look at the references, or you can buy the book. So, that's my thing, is that I think basically we're healing maladaptive epigenetic and programming is one of the ways that spiritual healing techniques give rise to emotional healing, and this is the argument that I'm trying to build. And, so I'm saying epigenetics seem to exist at the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality. And why do I say that? Well, we know that epigenetics can be altered in a positive way in some of these mental health problems with antidepressants. There's evidence for that, studies for that. Psychotherapy is also showing, like, wow, these epigenetics are being modified and altered in a positive direction. So that's there's no chemicals being exchanged, right? It's the presence of a loving therapist and walking through the process. Emotional processing meditation is also showing that it can alter the epigenetics in real time in advanced meditators. So I think that possibly the shamanism is doing the same thing. So I have this nonprofit organization called Modern Spirit, and we're going to start doing epigenetic research, hopefully, from some guys from Yale, University of Pittsburgh, that want to start exploring this. So now I want to open it up to questions. Sorry I raced through it, but I just want to get through everything. Thank you very much.
You talk about neuropeptides.
I don't know that much about neuropeptides,
The emotions are actually measurable neuropeptides. You can
Well,
measure
I mean,
frustration, you can measure anger.
I think that neuropeptides are one of the communication messenger molecules within the emotional body. So that's what it's looking like. When we talk about, as they study psychoneuroimmunology, and they start saying, oh, we thought that serotonin was a neurotransmitter, but then we're finding that these other tissues are also producing it, or epinephrine, or cortisol, or the cytokines from the immune. And we call them cytokines because white blood cells were the first ones that we discovered are producing those. Then we find that neurons are producing them, or these neuropeptides. So then the question is like these are messenger molecules of, related to our human experience. So I don't know all the details of the different neuropeptides as they relate to those different things, but I would say holistically that that we're learning that the emotional experiences does have a biological basis, which we already knew. And now the question is showing how neuropeptide responses might differ after somebody goes through an emotional healing process. That's kind of my area of interest. Yeah.
This all makes so much sense to me because since 11 years of age, I was so interested. I grew up near the woods and the fisherman and all that stuff, and interested in Native Indigenous people.
Right.
Then in the 60s, I read Carlos Castellanos and
Right.
the peyote thing, and everything just made intuitive sense to me. But I'm also living in a logic-based culture
Right.
and worked in educational institutions my whole life. And so I would say that my biggest concern, and I'd like you to help me understand, how can we take these things that are so working for people who come from a culture that is nature-based, back to the garden, the
Right.
whole
Right.
nature. They are ready to hear this.
But
I
we're
am ready.
doing this with Westerners.
But when I know we're doing it with Westerners, but the Western culture, when it sees the opportunity to make money, it goes like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And my concern and worry is people are going to grab it and start popping it like we pop big pharma pills
Right,
now, thinking that it's going to take it away. Everything that we do that gives us centered understanding of self, others, and the planet involves rigorous study and work and responsibility.
Right.
How do we healers and educators build those qualities into bringing this to the people as fast as we can?
Yeah, I think it's about raising the standard, you know what I mean? In other words, if we're talking about like, yeah, people, they're gonna try to do that, you know? And so we have the example of Peru where ayahuasca is legal. That's not really happening there. You know, they're not really interested, the financial forces in Peru are not interested in getting involved in the ayahuasca situation and have not been. And so here, you know, is that going to happen? I mean, we haven't seen that happen with peyote. We haven't seen it happen with these other things. So it could happen, and everyone's so worried about that happening. You know what I mean? Everyone's so like concerned about our corrupt kind of direction. But then there's this other direction. Now, there's all of us sitting here in this room. We're part of the culture. You guys are part of some of the thinking, the thought leadership of Los Angeles. You know, and you're not interested in that. So what are we going to do to protect this? For me, it's culture. You know what I mean? You have to educate people. They have to learn. We have to be honest. It's like, hey, they're fooling around with this stuff. They're not getting anywhere. It's like, I get a lot of people with very inexperienced, kind of they're into that. They just want to jump into ayahuasca, self-righteous. You know, I took it. Now I know what to do. I'm going to do it with somebody else, and they make a big mess. So it's about raising the standard beyond that. It's about that, and that's what I go around telling, because a lot of these young people, they come to the talks that I give, you know, because I give it at these even festivals and stuff. And so I can be a voice to tell them, you know, to their face, hey, you don't know what you're doing. Like, there is such a thing as a very advanced practice, and it's about sophisticating, you know, making our American culture a little more sophisticated than just like money is the most important thing.
Yeah, a lot more.
A lot more sophisticated, right? So we know, and it's just, we're riding the wave of the general realization that, yeah, money is not working out for us that great, you know? And this approach, big pharma approach to anxiety and depression is not really making a difference for people. And so it's about people not buying the propaganda anymore and being honest with themselves, you know, and it's the culture being honest with themselves. So all we can do is encourage that through education, I feel, and through the examples, and through showing like the results of these people who are bringing a lot of thought and care to the thing, like the MDMA assisted psychotherapy trial, you know. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's hope. I don't think they're going to win.
I hope.
Yeah, nah, they're losers.
Dr. Brian Weiss, he's the spiritual connection with Indian medicine, system therapy, past life regression, many masculine lives.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, it's a spiritual connection. Yeah, exactly. That's a very powerful thing. And so, the potential for that and the impact of that, it's like very interesting, that maybe depends a little bit on the talent of a person like him, to be able to do that with people, or also very advanced training. So it's like, it's people finding, it's just like this, the shamanism, I don't know that everyone is so gifted to be this great shaman. Some people are, and they go through the training and they become a great shaman, just like a great neurosurgeon. And so it's like developing that talent in people and providing more opportunities for people and showing the relevance of those kind of talents.
I think common ground is spirituality.
It's spirituality is the common ground. And so then how do we create common ground in a largely atheist, kind of academic setting? Is health. That's my focus. It's like, let's not talk about spirituality, let's talk about mental health. And let me show you that if you open yourself to if I can show you that opening your mind and opening your heart has a legitimate impact on your health, on your mental health, then that's a place to start. I don't have to convince you of a religion. I don't have to convince you of spiritual beliefs. I'm simply trying to get you out of your health problem. And so I think that's a very powerful way to bring universal spirituality.
I did have a few people wanting to talk about a little bit about your recent research with the Yale and Pittsburgh. I know it's at an early stage.
Yeah.
You might be able to talk about the research design.
Well, the research design is simply to try to demonstrate, and then this would be the same thing, it would be relevant to past life regression healing and stuff like that, is, if you're healing a family line, and how do you demonstrate, how do you prove that in the material world? And so then, the book is trying to say, hey, epigenetics may be a place to look at, that there is physiology related to some of these improvements, and maybe the epigenetics, epigenetics within the PNI network, for example, cortisol receptors, that they've examined when they did things like the concentration camp survivors, their children, and they're showing that they actually have markers on the cortisol receptors that are not from the parenting, because the parents have the same one as the kids. They seem like they were inherited epigenetically, and so focusing on those areas of the genome and looking for changes. Known areas of changes that have shown response to psychotherapy, known areas of changes that have shown response to antidepressants. Focusing on those areas and now doing saliva swabs on people in Peru, coming out of the treatment, and then hopefully doing it on the MDMA trial, the MAPS trial, and start showing the biology of some of this emotional healing through epigenetics. And so that would gain traction to expand the role of emotional healing, and the emotional healing opens the door to a more mystical kind of starting to talk about subjective experiences that don't have a physical foundation. Yes?
When you were doing your research reviewing these other studies, I know there was a placebo effect, and then you had some that combined healing, the shamanism healing, with the ayahuasca. But did they compare any of the studies to just the healing without the
Without the ayahuasca.
Without the ayahuasca or any
Right.
hallucinogen
Yeah.
or
Not in this case. There has been studies, and Paul Mills, the old lab I was at, they did energy healing research in psychoneuroimmunology lab.
what was the effectiveness of it?
They were using it for breast cancer survivors who had fatigue. So breast cancer survivors who have fatigue, that doctors, we don't have anything left for them. Like they went through the chemo, they say, I don't feel well, I'm still tired, and it's like, hey, hopefully you get better. And so then they pushed for this energy healing research, and they did have positive results. So I could direct you to that research.
But not with the shamanism per se?
They haven't done it, not with these shamans.
Because you got to account for the religious people who are against using any kind of non-alcoholic
Sure.
substance.
Well, and that's fine. And so then we're saying, go right ahead. You know what I mean? They can study faith healing in the United States whenever they like.
No, not necessarily in faith healing, but there's a lot of faiths are against using any kind of
Sure.
mind-altering substance.
Right. Except for coffee and antidepressants and blood pressure medication. And there's a huge hypocrisy, right? It's like it doesn't take too long to start getting that person a little uncomfortable
Right.
about what they're talking about.
Yeah, but specifically in the Muslim religion, with alcohol and
Sure.
and any kind of
And so yeah, and so I'm open to that. I'm not for hallucinogenics or against hallucinogenics. I'm saying using hallucinogenics in this context, like in the MDMA trial, is making a huge impact with these individuals. A lot of them weren't interested in hallucinogens before,
Yeah.
and they maybe went to a lot of different faith healers, and a lot of people who told them they could help them, energy healers and maybe religious healers, and they didn't get help. So that's why. That's why hallucinogenic psychedelics. It's not because I think they're the answer to religion or spirituality or in any way should dismiss the people.
You saw some, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
you saw some results, and we know that there's no drug company behind healing. So even with the plant-based substance, like even the Marble, like the Marble folks got behind using pods, which is available in green cigarettes, you know,
Right.
and they're trying to get money off of
Sure.
it, their plant-based, which they probably would if this made it big.
They're gonna do it, you know what I mean? But people are, so far, people are still smoking their own, like, the marijuana that they like to smoke, and there's all these, like, home microbrewery beer companies. I don't know, I just don't know if people are gonna just totally go for the generic. A lot of people will, but a lot of people won't. You know, they'll still want a higher product. You know, even Walmart is putting organic stuff in their aisles, you know what I mean? There is a response.
Right.
So it's like, is the American population lost sheep heading over the cliff? Is that the situation? And yes, it seems like it is. But there is consciousness alive. And it's not the media propaganda raining down on everybody. Like, they're starting to wake up a little bit, you know, and we have to hope for that, and we have to encourage that. And so,
I heard like in China, they have like in their hospitals, they have their alternative medicine, like healing and acupuncture and all that, and qigong healing. And one level of the hospital, then they have the Western medicine on another, and then they have it integrated in the middle, where they do both.
right.
And that's been going on for a long, long time, and I want to see that here.
Sure, no, and we do, and that's what this meeting and these people are about, is bringing that here. And like one thing, you know, Rael is teaching mindfulness to the residents, the psychiatry residents, so they're starting to bring that spiritual practice into the mental health thing, and slowly, and they're doing all this research around psychedelics, which opens the door, not just to using psychedelics, but that's what I'm saying, to show them why spiritual healing is so important, why love is so important, why forgiveness is so important, why compassion is so important, why gratitude is so important. So that it doesn't just have to be like religious, you know, and somebody, I don't like hearing about that, that's religious. It's like, no, in healthcare it's useful.
One more question.
Okay, one more question.
Okay, that's 2 parts. One is with epigenetic research that's going on, are they actually showing that active genes that they become inactive? Is that actually
That's what
measured?
epigenetics is showing, yes, that you can modify the expression of the genes. So in other words, this gene is expressed to make the mRNA and make the proteins, and you can show these translation products are altered because of the epigenetics, and that's in fact how genetics works.
And so if they're actually becoming dormant and that's being shown, that can be...
Dormant, or, you know, more or less active, you know, maybe not totally off, but less active or more appropriately active, you know, modifying the function, yes.
Okay, second question was, does any of these...
Not with this, not with psychedelics. I'm suggesting that all other research points to maybe the psychedelics are doing this too. They haven't done it with psychedelics.
Second part of the question is, have any of these studies been done with autism? You did mention autism.
Yeah, no, people are interested in, you know, trying to approach autism from an epigenetic approach and trying to find things that would help them along those lines. Not with ayahuasca or psychedelics, although people are very curious about that and potentially that it could be helpful.
Or Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's as well, and Parkinson's.
Thank you.